Alice and Ruby were sisters, as close as the sky and the stars. Alice, 18, had always been Ruby's protector. Ruby, just 13, was quiet, spending her days reading and painting, a solace in their little world. But their lives turned upside down when their mother, their anchor, lost her battle with cancer. Before their mother's passing, she had been meticulous. Knowing her sister Becky's greed and selfishness, she ensured that her daughters would be financially secure. She left them a house, money for living expenses, and an educational fund locked away until Ruby turned 18. After the funeral, the sisters tried to adjust. Ruby clung to her books and art to cope, but Alice struggled. She began spending her evenings out, drawn to the thrill of parties and the company of a much older man named Bob. He exuded a charm that felt too practiced, too cold. "He's just helping me relax." Alice shrugged when Ruby voiced her concerns, and she disliked Bob from start. His rough appearance and the way his eyes lingered on Ruby made her uneasy. Yet Alice dismissed her concerns, calling her overly sensitive. As Alice spiraled into late nights and questionable habits, Ruby retreated further into her books. Bob soon became a constant presence in their home, bringing with him a toxic cloud of drinking, smoking, and chaos. Bob's unnerving glances unsettled Ruby, but she was unsure if it was her imagination. He and Alice often partied until dawn, leaving Ruby to retreat to her room, the only space where she felt safe. One fateful night, while Alice lay passed out from substance use, Bob crossed a line. He cornered Ruby in her room, his sinister intentions clear. Ruby fought with all her might, but he overpowered her. She was assaulted, leaving her bruised and broken. When Ruby gathered the courage to tell Alice, showing her bruises as proof. But Alice's response shattered Ruby's heart. "You're jealous," she accused. "You're trying to ruin my relationship." Bob denied everything, painting Ruby as a liar. Ruby's haven became her friend's house, where she often sneaked away to escape Bob's menacing presence. Her trust in Alice was crumbling, leaving her feeling alone in a world that had grown dark. When Ruby could no longer bear the atmosphere at home, she approached their Aunt Becky, hoping for stability. Becky reluctantly agreed to take Ruby in, but insisted on accessing part of her inheritance for living expenses. A formal agreement was made, and Ruby moved in. Aunt Becky's boyfriend, Jack, was always around, a calculating man with a sharp eye for opportunity. Life with Becky wasn't the haven Ruby had hoped for. Becky's true nature soon emerged. A known spender, she treated Ruby's inheritance money like a jackpot, buying cars, redecorating the house, and investing in her boyfriend Jack's failing business, while neglecting Ruby's emotional needs. Ruby's living allowance quickly evaporated, leaving Becky financially strained. Ruby began noticing the cracks in her new home. Becky and Jack's arguments about money grew louder, and Ruby's concerns about her future deepened. Little did she know, a sinister plan was brewing in the shadows. One evening, Ruby overheard an argument. Jack mentioned Ruby's insurance policy, planted in her name by her late mother. "If anything happened to Ruby, you'd get a hefty payout," he pointed out. "That money could fix everything." "What are you saying?" Becky shot back. "But Alice is the beneficiary," she argued. "You're her guardian now," Jack replied. "We can fix that." Ruby didn't understand or stay to hear the rest, but a chill ran through her. Something about the conversation felt wrong. Ruby's days grew lonelier as Becky and Jack became more distant. Her intuition proved correct. One morning, as she walked to school, she never imagined that a simple encounter could change everything. The car pulled up beside her, its engine humming quietly as the door clicked open. She recognized Jack in the driver's seat. "Hop in," he said with a strained smile. "Your aunt wanted me to take you to school today." Ruby hesitated. "I can walk," she replied, stepping back. But Jack's smile faded, his expression darkening in a way that sent a chill down her spine. Before she could react, the car door swung open, and in one swift motion, a rough hand grabbed her arm. She was pulled inside before she could even protest. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't fight back against Jack's accomplices sat next to her on the back seat. Ruby's chest tightened, her breath shallow as her body trembled with fear. As the car sped down the road, Ruby's mind raced, her thoughts muddled in the panic that gripped her. She struggled to keep calm, tried to think of a way to escape, but there was no way out. She turned toward Jack, her voice barely a whisper. "Where are you taking me?" Jack didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the road, his face impassive, as though he didn't even see her as a person anymore, just something to be discarded. With every passing second, Ruby's fear deepened. She tried to focus on her breathing, to calm herself. They weren't heading to school at all. They were going somewhere far worse, somewhere Ruby couldn't yet imagine. "Where are we going?" she asked again, this time her voice trembling with tears. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was pounding so loudly in her chest that it felt as though it might explode. She looked at the man beside her, his gaze fixed forward, cold and unfeeling. He didn't even acknowledge her. Ruby's mind screamed for her to act, to do anything that might give her a chance, but she was trapped between the two men. As the car turned off the main road into more unfamiliar road, the trees lining the road became thicker and the buildings less frequent until the car came to a stop. The fear that had been building inside Ruby now exploded into a terror she couldn't contain. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through her chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking as she tried to steady her shaking hands. "Please, I just want to go home. Please." But the men didn't listen. They opened the door, and before Ruby could react, they grabbed her roughly by the arms, dragging her out of the car. Her feet scrambled for traction on the gravel, but it was no use. She was too weak, too terrified, and their strength overwhelmed her. She fought back with everything she had, her limbs flailing as she tried to break free. But the more she struggled, the more tightly they gripped her. "Stop! Please, let me go!" Ruby screamed, but her pleas were ignored. Her body was shoved to the ground, the cold dirt scraping against her skin as the world around her spun in a blur of fear and pain. She tried to get up, to run, but they kicked her down, each blow landing with a sickening force that left her gasping for air. Ruby's vision blurred, and the pain became too much to bear. She could barely breathe, her head throbbing, her body bruised and battered, her body losing strength as she lay on the ground, broken and powerless. She blacked out and left lying there knowing she will not survive for another half an hour. Ruby's eyelids fluttered open slowly, the faint beeping of machines in the background the only sound that greeted her in the stark, sterile hospital room. Her body ached in ways she had never known. Each breath a struggle, each movement a reminder of the battle she had fought, though she couldn't remember the war. The bruises on her face, the soreness in her muscles, and the heaviness in her mind were all fragments of a nightmare she couldn't fully piece together. As Ruby's bleary vision adjusted to the dim light, she saw a face hovering near her, full of concern and tenderness. Mrs. Lambard, a kind woman in her mid-50s, sat beside her bed, gently grasping her hand. Her touch was soft, warm, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal machines that surrounded Ruby. The Lambards found Ruby when walking their dog early that evening. "You're safe now," Mrs. Lambard whispered, her voice as soothing as the touch of her hand. "You're safe, Ruby. We won't leave you." The words, though simple, washed over Ruby in waves. Safe. It was a word she hadn't dared to believe in a long time. She felt the tears pricking the corners of her eyes, tears she didn't even know she had the strength to shed. The weight of her grief, the exhaustion of everything she had endured, began to surface in a rush. But Mrs. Lambard was there, holding her hand, offering a kindness that Ruby had long forgotten could exist. Ruby's breath hitched as her mind tried to grasp at the memories that seemed just out of reach, taunting her with their elusiveness. She had lost so much, and yet here she was, in this room, in these arms, the Lambards. She didn't know why they had come to her aid, why they had taken her in without question. But the moment Mrs. Lambard had spoken those words, Ruby knew that, in some way, they had become her family. They weren't blood, but their hearts felt just as tied to hers as if they were. Days passed in a haze. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body healing, her heart aching. It was during one of those quieter moments, when the world outside seemed distant, that Ruby found the strength to speak. Her voice, raw and broken, trembled as she recounted the fragments of her story to the Lambards. I don't know what happened," she murmured, her eyes filling with tears as memories of her mother flooded her mind. "My mother? She's gone. She was the only one who ever loved me. And then—" Her words faltered, her throat tight. She squeezed Mrs. Lambard's hand desperately, needing the comfort, needing to believe there was still some goodness left in the world. "My aunt, she betrayed me." Mrs. Lambard's face tightened with sorrow, her heart breaking for the girl she had come to care for. She gently brushed a tear from Ruby's cheek and simply held her. Mr. Lambard, standing nearby, nodded solemnly, his face a mixture of anger and sadness. "No one should ever go through that," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "No one." Ruby's chest heaved as the weight of her grief pressed down upon her once more. She closed her eyes, the floodgates opening as her sobs filled the room. The Lambards, though devastated by the pain she carried, stayed close, patient, steadfast. They didn't rush her to speak, didn't demand answers. They simply allowed her the space to heal, to process what she could, and then, with the gentleness only true kindness could bring, they made her a promise. They had no obligation, no responsibility to take her in, but in the quiet moments between their conversations and shared meals, they knew without a doubt that they would. They would be her family now. "You don't have to face this alone," Mr. Lambard said, his voice firm yet filled with an unwavering kindness. "We're here for you, Ruby, whatever you need, whatever you want." Ruby's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe those words. Whatever you want. The idea that someone, anyone, would care enough to give her a chance at healing felt like a dream. But it was real. They were real. As the days turned into weeks, Ruby began to feel the warmth of the Lambards' love wrap around her like a blanket on a cold night. They never pressed her for more than she was ready to give. They simply offered their home, their hearts, and the security she had lost. She learned to trust again, slowly, cautiously. But with every passing day, she felt her strength return. The healing process wasn't easy, and Ruby knew there would be dark days ahead. But in that moment, with Mrs. Lambard still holding her hand, and Mr. Lambard sitting quietly beside them, Ruby felt something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. It was fragile, delicate, but it was there. Living with the Lambards was nothing short of a rebirth for Ruby. The security and warmth she had once believed were only illusions slowly became her reality. The Lambards' home, with its quiet, comforting rhythm, was a sanctuary in every sense of the word. They didn't ask for much from her, only that she heal, find herself again, and when she was ready, explore the world that had been so cruelly ripped from her. Mrs. Lambard, with her gentle ways, and Mr. Lambard, always steady and strong, made it clear that Ruby was not just a guest, not just a charity case. She was family. They enrolled her in a nearby private school, one with smaller classes and teachers who would be more patient with her trauma. At first, Ruby was hesitant. She was still unsure of herself, still carrying the heavy burden of her past, but with their encouragement, she slowly found her place. The school wasn't like the ones she had known before. It was different, more nurturing, more personal. She was no longer a faceless student lost in the shuffle. Here, teachers noticed her, cared for her, and praised her artistic talents. Ruby had always painted as a way to escape, a way to make sense of her feelings. But now, with the Lambards' unwavering support, she began to see her art as something more than just an outlet. It was a voice. She poured her heart onto canvases, each stroke of her brush a release, a shedding of the pain she had carried for so long. Her paintings were full of raw emotion, vivid colors that depicted both anguish and hope, a kaleidoscope of sorrow and redemption. Slowly but surely, Ruby began to find her peace in the world of art. It was like breathing again after being submerged for so long. With every brushstroke, she was learning to breathe for herself. But even as Ruby's world was beginning to heal, the same could not be said for Becky and Jack. Their lives, once so filled with the promise of riches and a new start, were quickly unraveling. Becky, whose ambition and greed had fueled their twisted scheme, was now haunted by the consequences of their actions. Jack, too, could feel the walls closing in around them. They had been so sure of their plan, so confident that Ruby's disappearance would clear the path to the money they so desperately needed. But they hadn't counted on one thing: the authorities. The demand for proof of Ruby's death had shaken them to their core. It wasn't just the fact that the police were now involved, it was the tightening of the noose. The lies they had spun were starting to fray at the edges, and with every passing day, they found themselves sinking deeper into a pit they couldn't climb out of. Ruby's body had never been found, which meant the authorities were holding on to a thread of hope that she might still be alive, that there might be something they were overlooking. Desperation began to set in. Becky and Jack had already spent some of the money they had hoped to claim, making dubious investments in the hopes of a quick return. But their financial troubles, once manageable, had spiraled beyond their control. Bills piled up, creditors started knocking on the door, and every corner they turned seemed to offer only more obstacles. They had put all their eggs in one basket, the insurance payout that was supposed to solve all their problems, and now, without Ruby's death certificate, it was slipping further out of their reach. Jack, ever the impulsive one, began to talk about more extreme measures, his frustration boiling over. "We can't just let this slip through our fingers," he grumbled one night, pacing in the cramped living room they had barely been able to afford since they lost their last big deal. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Becky, though, was losing faith. The fear that had once been masked by their shared greed was now bubbling to the surface. She couldn't shake the thought that Ruby might still be alive, that she could come back at any moment and blow the whole thing wide open. The life they had dreamed of, built on deception, was beginning to crumble in ways they hadn't foreseen. "What if she's out there?" Becky asked one evening, her voice shaking with the fear she hadn't dared voice before. "What if she comes back, tells them everything?" Jack's response was sharp, desperate. "She's gone. She has to be." But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. They had no proof, nothing concrete, only a fading hope that Ruby would remain a ghost in their past. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that hope was a fragile thing, and it might soon shatter. In the Lambards' home, Ruby was flourishing in ways she never imagined. She was no longer the broken girl who had stumbled into their lives, lost and afraid. With each passing day, the pieces of her shattered past were being put back together, like an intricate puzzle, one small step at a time. The Lambards never pressured her to forget what had happened, nor did they expect her to instantly be whole again. They simply allowed her the space to grow, slowly, patiently, and with love. But far away, Becky and Jack's world was spinning out of control. The lies they had woven were no longer enough to keep the truth at bay. Desperation was beginning to claw at them, and in the end, desperation always leads to mistakes. As Ruby's life began to bloom again, the dark web Becky and Jack had spun around her was coming undone. The question wasn't if they would be caught, it was when. Meanwhile, Alice sat by herself on the cold, cracked sidewalk, her knees drawn up to her chest, trying to protect herself from the biting wind. The city buzzed with activity, but she felt like a ghost in her own life. The sounds and the rush of people felt far away, like a place she no longer fit into. Not long ago, Alice had a life full of hope, a future that seemed limitless. Now, all that remained were the frayed pieces of that life, reminders of choices she wished she could change. Bob. Just thinking about him made her stomach twist. He had vanished with the money he made her sold their home, leaving Alice to deal with the wreckage of a life she hadn't realized was crumbling. She had trusted and loved him. But when things got tough, when their future looked bleak, he disappeared like a wisp of smoke. The betrayal was a scar that never fully healed. It wasn't just about losing the house or the money. It was the feeling of being abandoned that haunted her daily. She had believed they were a team, but in the end, he had only used her to escape. After that, Alice's life shattered. She dropped out of university, unable to concentrate on her studies. What was the point? Without a home and the stability she once had, she couldn't find the motivation to continue. She drifted from place to place, staying in shelters and depending on the kindness of strangers. Some days she struggled to get out of bed, while other days she felt the sharp sting of shame asking for help, unable to afford even a small meal. People came and went. Some were nice, others indifferent, but none stayed. In such a big city, Alice felt more isolated than ever before. The isolation was more than just being alone. It was a deep, painful loneliness that came from the heavy guilt in her heart. Each night, as she closed her eyes, thoughts of Ruby filled her mind. Ruby, the girl she had treated so poorly. She had hurt Ruby in ways that could never be fixed, and that thought haunted her. Alice had always seen herself as a good person, someone who tried to help others, but with Ruby, she had been unkind. She had taken advantage of Ruby's kindness and turned away when Ruby needed her the most. Now Ruby was gone, her life seemingly shattered by events Alice had influenced. The guilt over how she treated Ruby was a constant pain in Alice's heart.